Thank you, Carly. And first up, we have Jeff.
Hi, my name is Jeff Sinzebux. I'm the president and CEO of Empowering People's Independence, or EPI. I'm also the board chair of Epilepsy Alliance America.
And Nanette.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nanette Roble, and I am a clinical pharmacist that has worked with the IDD population for about 40 years, currently working at Tarrytown Expo Care Pharmacy.
Teresa.
Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Granum. I'm a registered nurse, and I am Director of Clinical and Medical Services here at EPI.
Hi, everyone. I am Doug Golub. I am president at Metasced, where we provide electronic records, but also do some of the research that you see today. And with that, today should be a very interesting conversation. There's some data that we're sharing that is some of it being presented for the first time at a conference here in conference form. We'll be taking a look at psychiatric disorders for people with epilepsy, but using machine learning and understanding some of those outcomes on the individual, some of the well-being. What can we tell by using machine learning today in 2022 as this is being recorded? So some of those trends that are available correlating to life events for individuals, and some of the machine learning to see the correlation with the types of anti-epileptic drugs that individuals are on. And so taking some of what Nanette shares with us at the beginning and overlaying that with the data available through the electronic health record. We also take a look at opportunities for predictive models for impacts on staff, and finally bringing it all together and understanding more for epilepsy, for its impact on mental health and well-being, its impact on the individual, and the applications for machine learning to tie it all together. Some disclaimers for this presentation. All the data is de-identified. We changed the names and altered the stories of the individuals that we focus on in the studies to preserve the privacy of the individuals, but each of the stories are based on real people. We have used machine learning and artificial intelligence in this presentation, and it's in its very early stages for human services. In fact, this is probably one of the first presentations anywhere that you'll see it done, so that's exciting. These results are not intended for clinical decision support yet. They're not intended for human resource management. They're not intended for any other purpose other than to illustrate and raise the bar on what could be possible, hopefully within the next decade. Also, there may be some differences between brand and generic drugs, but to illustrate the psychotropic effects of anti-epileptic drugs, we've used the brand names. We do understand there are differences, but we've used some of the brand names to be able to group cohorts of individuals and medications together. So with that, we begin with Nanette.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to this Friday afternoon session. You know, the old adage is we save the best for last. And while I can't quantitatively tell you that this is going to be the best session that you attend, I will say I think this is going to be one of the most exciting sessions. So I will tell you, one of the things that I was very excited about when Doug approached the group of us, and me in particular, was to really delve into something that has always been fascinating to me. And that's the relationship between seizure disorder in our individuals and their psych challenges, which they have. So as a young pharmacist, when I first started in this field, I recognized that I needed to learn a lot about seizures, but I also needed to learn a lot about behaviors. Now, we have a couple of things that we use as our basis. So in order to treat seizures, we know that we use anti-seizure medications, and many times after we do so, behaviors can improve. But we also know that if we choose other medications, and specifically the antipsychotic class, that sometimes they can lower the seizure threshold, making it more likely that our individuals will have seizures. So really, there's a correlation between these two that is very strong. Now, one of the things that we didn't know as well, and we're beginning to find this information out, is what is the reported incidence of both those with seizures and those with behavior issues in our population? And is it higher for those with individuals with a diagnosis of IDD? And if so, why is it higher? And if we look a little bit further, are there specific types of lesions that are most prevalent in our individuals that would predict when they would have seizures and why they would have seizures? And then also, can we predict, for instance, what type of residents might have a higher incidence of seizures? And with the seizure diagnosis, where do those seizures happen? Is it a particular foci that's located? And in looking at all of this material, what we find out is, yes, the incidence the incidence is higher for our individuals with IDD. There are some risk factors for developing psychosis and epilepsy, so you can see some of them here. But what we also see is that particular types of seizures, particularly the complex partial seizures, have a higher incidence, even more so than generalized epilepsy, which is not something that we predicted. Now, when we also look at depression, we see that there is a strong correlation between depression and individuals with IDD. And in fact, we see, if you look through here and ask the question, is depression part of the epilepsy or is it because of the epilepsy? What we find is that those individuals that carry a diagnosis of IDD and epilepsy actually have quite a high incidence of depression, 55% versus 30%. And so we know that depression is really related to a specific psych syndrome and can be related to the seizure that they have. Now, other psychological factors associated with depression, as you can see here, yes, we know it has to do with for instance, serotonin and dopamine and GABA receptors in our brain. We recognize that, but is depression related to a particular area of the brain? Do we see those that have, for instance, certain lesions, whether they're right-sided or left-sided lesions? Do they have more incidence of depression? Is there a higher frequency of depression in those originating in limbic structures or those with frontal lobe dysfunction? Those are questions that we can answer as well. And then moving on, are there some anti-seizure medications that actually can cause depression in our individuals? So if you look at this list, for instance, these are common anti-seizure medications that are used, and yet when we use them, not only is the incidence higher of depression due to the fact that they have seizures, but now we're aggravating it by adding medications on board that can actually make depression even worse. And consequently, are there medications with positive psychotropic properties? Yes, there are. But we also need to consider what happens when these medications are discontinued in our individuals. If, for instance, a psychiatrist comes in and stops the use of a couple of these medications, which are commonly used as mood stabilizers. Lastly, what we also looked at was anxiety disorders, which, as you can see here, can be high, very high, as high as 57%. Where do they occur in the seizure? Are they attributed to particular receptives? And we also need to think to ourselves, are we able to identify them? Are they associated with certain types of seizures? You see here, often associated with simple partial seizures. We have to discern those types of anxiety disorders versus those that may be manifested because of fear or because of panic. And then also taking into consideration our non-motor symptoms of focal seizures. So our individuals who don't necessarily walk up to us and tell us that they're having an aura in which they're going to start having a seizure, instead may present in different ways. Sensory phenomenon can occur, maybe seeing things, hearing voices, which we mistake for psychosis, psychologically feeling like they've been in a situation before or met people before and now can't identify them, uncontrolled laughter or crying, or even changes in the autonomic system, as you can see here. So anxiety and frequency of seizure is also very high. Interestingly, a couple of different points as well. The lower seizure frequency has the second highest amount of anxiety. And high seizure frequency is really related to the lowest amount of anxiety. Again, something that we would not necessarily predict. And then the risk is higher in certain types of seizures, not only focal seizures, but frontal lobe epilepsy, lower and temporal lobe epilepsy.
Thank you again, Ed. And that definitely sets the stage for an understanding of what research we were doing to try to look at some of the causation or correlation. So we used a technology that is hopefully going to become a lot more prevalent in the years ahead, called machine learning. working with Metasced and with EPI. EPI probably has 16 or 17 years worth of data in their Metasced database, creating a great opportunity for data mining, and that's what we did. Specifically for today's research, we used sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis is simply being able to read a service note or a clinical note and be able with some level of accuracy to identify whether that note was positive, negative, or neutral. And that's what we did for this to correlate with epilepsy, seizures, and other life events for individuals. And so, as I said earlier, this is in its early stages. There were definitely false positives and false negatives in the early stages, but to move the needle forward for what's possible is why we're here today. The United States Department of Health and Human Services has identified machine learning as a goal for person-centered outcomes by 2029. We figured that's a pretty long time to wait, so what can we do now? And where they see predictive decision support and other key terms, one of the other items that was identified by the Department of Health and Human Services in its 10-year plan is also to use AI solutions to enhance accessibility and interoperability of unstructured data to advance person-centered outcomes. Unstructured data is simply free-flowing text, narrative, paragraphs. And fortunately, for this one time, human service providers have plentiful unstructured data, which is exactly what we had the opportunity to work with to mine things that were very secure, but very archived for very many years, and years worth of service notes that we may not have been looking at regularly after time. We now can pretty easily with machine learning, and we do that today and correlate it to epilepsy. One of the tools that we use through the machine learning is something called a Vader score, not that Vader, valence-aware dictionary for sentiment reasoning. It's a dictionary of machine learning that helps to read human-written narratives and be able to identify the tone. So it can pick up on words like I love, I enjoy, I'm happy. It can also pick up on terms like I did not love, I'm having a bad day. It can use that to identify and graph, well, the Metasced part did the graphing, but to identify over the course of time, how are we doing and what is the general tone? And this was an interesting presentation to put together because we had a hypothesis that we'd be able to find it, but we weren't entirely sure if these graphs would tell us anything useful. So specifically with Vader scores, here's some de-identified examples. Here's an example of something that by and large was written by a staff member. So here's an individual who independently exercised using the bike pedals for 20 minutes. He was verbally prompted to use the computer to look up his area of interest, and he researched trains. He was verbally prompted to speak clearly while talking and work on better posture. Staff praised the individual on a great job. He smiled and said, I try for you, and he laughed. And by and large, through machine learning and reading, it reads this note as generally positive, actually very positive, 99% positive. Another example here is, here's an individual who arrived at a program on time. He was prompted to be socially appropriate, but he refused. He became frustrated and verbally aggressive towards staff. He was asked to stop and to talk about what made him upset, but he refused. He was verbally and physically aggressive towards his peer. He was restrained. He eventually calmed down and talked about what upset him. And this is based on a much longer but note from a de-identified individual. And machine learning read this and said within 96.9% confidence, this probably was a pretty negative note. And we had a chance to have, through over and over learning, would probably agree. Here's an example of a note. A person read a book, went on a short walk, worked on online training, talked about transition services, conversed appropriately with his peers, was praised for hospitality, was polite. He responded by, he was praised for being hospitable and for being polite. He responded by looking down. And so this is a 49.5% confidence that this was a positive note. Over the course of the study, 0.495 actually is the average. So we kind of see this as neutral. This is the average note, which is good for a larger population. But you can kind of see what we've been doing and reading these hundreds of thousands of these notes in order to find some trends and opportunities to tie back to medications and other life events. And so with that, we're able to take a look at trends for a person living with epilepsy. And we'd like to describe EPI and Epilepsy Alliance America, the organizations that we collaborated with to find the data trends and to help identify how we can move the world of epilepsy, move the world of dual diagnosis, move the world of machine learning a little bit further today and beyond. And so with that, we have Jeff.
Okay, so at EPI, our mission, we empower people with disabilities, neurological, and chronic health conditions to pursue a life of their choosing. We work with people, we're hoping to get people better connected to the communities that they live in so that they can be valued and thrive. From an impact, we service area runs south of Lake Ontario, north of Pennsylvania, in the western and central part of New York State. We have almost 1,000 employees. We serve about 1,000 people with IDD and about 6,000 people that have epilepsy, some correlation between the two, and quite a few hours of service we provide to individuals with TBI and stroke. Epilepsy Alliance America, we are one of the founding members of this. It's a national organization helping, and again, its mission is to support people on local levels, local communities, but using the guidance of a national organization to do that. And then from services, what we do as an agency, we have kind of three main buckets here, and epilepsy can fall into all of those buckets. We have an IDD bucket where we provide a lot of Medicaid paid services, residential, self-direction, day programming, respite, environmental modifications and assistive technology, and other supports. In our epilepsy service environment, we have a camp, we have education, networking, scholarships, other things like that to assist people with epilepsy. And in our brain injury services, some Medicaid paid services, day programming, counseling, again, environmental modification and those types of things. So we had connected to Medisked, one of their earlier clients. I think this is probably about 17, 18 years ago, connected, start using it in our brain injury arena, but we're such fans of the software that we moved it into different parts of our agency. We've been using this data in our residential program for a while. So when Doug reached out and said, well, geez, we've got all this great data in our residential program in Medisked, and the vast majority of people that live in our group homes also have epilepsy. So you have this great correlation between people that have epilepsy, good data on them that sets this up. So Teresa will now walk you through some individual case studies.
Thanks, Jeff.
The first story that we're going to look at is Mark. He is a male in his late 30s and resides in a group home setting. He takes oxcarbazepine or Trileptal, Lamictal, and Topamax. He used to go to his parents' home every other weekend. In the beginning of 2020, he could not go to his parents' home due to the COVID lockdowns, which resulted in sadness. In the summer of 2020, he was happy to see his parents outdoors. In the fall and winter of 2020, lockdowns returned and negative responses occurred. In the beginning of 2021, he did not see his parents due to his father's illness. Over the remainder of 2021, he gradually returned to his day program, seeing his parents for community activities such as baseball games, walks at the reservoir and parks that resulted in happiness. In the beginning of 2022, his parents did not visit with him due to their medical procedures. In February of 2022, he had his first seizure in over 4 years. The remainder of 2022 has been positive for Mark as he's returned to his day program and spending a couple of hours on a Saturday with his parents. The next story is about Joe, who is a male in his early 50s, and he resides in a group home setting. He takes Klonopin, Dilantin, Lamictal, and Keppra. Joe worries about his parents traveling to Florida in the fall of 2018 and 2019, as noted in the graph. In 2020, his parents remained in Florida due to COVID. He speaks with his parents via phone, but it is not the same as seeing them in person. Joe is not able to travel to Florida. The data shows he continues to worry about his parents and his father's service dog. He has been seizure-free for over 10 years. The next story is about Maggie. She's a female in her mid-50s and resides in a group home setting. She takes Tegretol and Epidiolex. In 2017, she lived in an apartment setting, however, required additional supports. In February of 2018, she moved into an IRA, an individual residential alternative. During 2018 to 2021, she was positive. In the summer of 2022, she became anxious regarding upcoming procedures of a colonoscopy in October, a total knee replacement in November, and future brain surgery due to frequent seizures. Overall, the data reveals she is still more positive than when she lived in the apartment setting.
Thank you, Teresa. And so you can see how the data can be used just from the service notes that the staff are writing with the individual. And there are enough of those service notes to be able to create a monthly average that pretty much aligns with the story and helps us. This is looking backwards. Well, you can only look backwards, right? This is looking backwards. But we also have the opportunity to provide interventions and notice when there are trends that are trending in a direction, and hopefully provide those interventions before they've trended too far. Next up, we take a look at some of the machine learning on cohorts of individuals that are taking anti-epileptic drugs, like the 3 people that you just saw for a larger study set. So from EPI, we primarily studied individuals living in group residences because EPI has all of the med records for those individuals. As we mentioned earlier, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals supported with epilepsy. However, we wanted as close to perfect medication records as we could get in order to run the study. So we filtered to 52 individuals, including 12 people that changed medications. But most of these individuals were on only one class of medication for the study that we looked at. And in order to do that over the course of a 3-year period, we also looked at 241 direct support professionals that regularly logged service notes regularly for these 52 individuals. So over this course of time, we were able to study 22,935 service notes to help identify trends, causation, and correlation between the different medications, anti-epilepsy drugs, and the sentiment for individuals on those drugs to tie back to what Nanette mentioned earlier, which were signs of depression and anxiety through the actual narrative being entered each day, each opportunity, each encounter for an individual. So these 52 individuals were in the study, have epilepsy and take anti-epileptic drugs. We also wanted to calculate a baseline score of everybody, people with and without epilepsy, people with and without anti-epileptic drugs, because given that artificial intelligence and given that machine learning is such in its infancy, there aren't really great standards out there yet. So we decided to benchmark against everybody else that receives supports at EPI. So there's no like national benchmark for this yet. There will be in the future, but we could run a benchmark on that. And in order to do that, we studied about 300,000 notes for individuals supported by EPI through their Metasced Connect database. Every single encounter, every single note gets a score on a range of -1 to 1. We found that 0.495 or plus 0.495 is the baseline, which is the average, so generally positive. And in order to run this larger study, we looked at 1,209 individuals with and without epilepsy, and there were 1,225 unique direct support professionals that wrote notes for these individuals that helped us to understand the data we were looking at for the larger population, and then specifically for those individuals in the study, that we studied with epilepsy and medication records that could help us understand. And that puts individuals into one of two cohorts based on their medications for these 52 individuals. Back to what Nanette had mentioned earlier, on the left here, we have drugs like Keppra, Ativan, diazepam. These are anti-epileptic drugs that may aggravate anxiety and depression. They come with black box warnings as a result. On the right side over here, these are drugs that may also aggravate anxiety and depression, but have positive psychotropic effects. Specifically, these are drugs that have mood stabilizing properties to them. And when we compared the cohort of individuals on the left versus those on the right over a 3-year period for the medications that they took, what we found were, by and large, individuals with epilepsy do have notes that are below the baseline average more than the general public, which we already knew. So there are higher rates of anxiety and depression for the individuals with epilepsy. Otherwise, this would be 50-50. However, when we looked at it, there's actually a huge shift, a big difference in those percentages of the time that the notes are positive above the baseline versus below the baseline. And when we looked at it by cohort based on the medications people were on for all of those notes, we absolutely found a correlation. The improvement from this 20% to this 27% in raw number of notes is 35% improvement in sentiment, the tone of the notes that are written. And there are many factors to this, right? There's the staff and everything else, but over the course of time, this does begin to average out when you have a critical number of individuals. For this reason, there are certain medications that we didn't study. For example, Epidiolex had some really good outcomes, but didn't have enough people that were on it to be able to uniquely identify if it was the study or if it was just the people. So what we call in research our cell count, or how many people do we consider before we can do a study on it. And that's where we come up next. So here's the first, just basically seeing the difference between that. Nanette, did I leave anything out on the drugs themselves?
No, that sounded really good, Doug.
Okay, thanks. So next up, we looked at the drugs themselves. And what we studied here, we took a look at these Vader scores and the same drugs again. We looked at the top 5 most commonly prescribed drugs for the people that were in our study. And we looked at their sentiment analysis. We read their service notes, every one of them, and helped identify all of those times that they were positive versus negative. And what we found, interesting enough, the 2 most popular drugs that are, or sorry, not the 2 most popular, but the 2 most positive drugs that have the most positive psychotropic effects. And again, every person, every individual is unique. It's not necessarily the drug that does it. However, when you study 20 people on the same drug, you begin to be able to, in our case, 52 people, you begin to find some suggestions and opportunities in the research question. And so specifically, of the top drugs that were prescribed to those individuals, and there were many drugs, but of the top AEDs that were prescribed, we did find that number 1 and number 2 were Depakote and Tegretol, with the most positive, average positive sentiments of those notes. Interesting enough, Depakote and Tegretol also end up on this list over here of those that are known to have positive mood stabilizers and positive psychotropic effects. And so we can clearly see that. Another research question is we also see perhaps for Tegretol a bit more negative, but the average positive is there, and this gives us more to continue to study, that there, causation or correlation, there are enough people in the study to show that the machine learning may be telling us something that we already knew or that we didn't know about how these notes are, how these drugs and the individuals that are on them are responding, and how staff are documenting their service notes and clinical notes. It's clearly showing a difference. The next 3 most popular drugs were Ativan, gabapentin, and Klonopin, and also did show some positive notes for the people that were on them. However, the most positive average sentiment as we mentioned in the previous slide, there is a difference. It's a decent percentage difference. It's not night and day, but there definitely is a difference between the people on drugs that are known to have positive psychotropic effects versus those that are known to aggravate anxiety and depression. And we can see that in the 5 most commonly prescribed drugs, and we can see that on the previous slide in the average positive note and the average negative note.
You know, Doug, the only other comment I would make on this is what I found very interesting when I saw this information for the first time was that those of us who are very familiar with these medications, knowing that they're drugs, that they are mood stabilizers, say, well, this kind of proves our point. That is exactly why we use these drugs. But you also have to remember that those that are writing the notes are looking at it as an anti-seizure medication, and they're not necessarily making the correlation that this is a mood stabilizer that I'm talking about. They reflect, interestingly, exactly what we know without any bias by the writer.
Right, that's right. That for several of these individuals, they weren't on antidepressants or mood stabilizers or SSRIs for that point. They were on Depakote or Tegretol for their seizures. And that's right, the staff did not know necessarily that Depakote also serves as a mood stabilizer with positive psychotropic effects. And so actually the staff, we studied notes going back quite a ways. When the staff wrote these service notes, they knew that they had all of their regulations to adhere to. They knew they had policies and quality and compliance to document. I don't think they ever knew that these notes would, several years from now be pulled up again, not by an auditor, but by machine learning to actually read them and try to extract trends. They never knew that. That was never disclosed.
Yeah, Doug, when I look, there's a comment too that talks about, what can happen when staff learn that's the case, but the staff primarily are using this to document for billing records, behavior notes, med adherence, but they don't necessarily know all of the pieces. So they're truly not influenced there in the way that they're writing the notes about this study.
Right. Also, when we take a look at the federal DHHS guidelines and some of the concerns and ethics behind it, there definitely is a concern, and that's why we wanted to do some of the research now. There definitely is a concern for staff, and that's actually the next topic that we get into, that you want the staff to have unbiased service notes, and that works in 2 ways. One is to not have any fear that if they write something negative, that somehow that will reflect poorly on the staff's performance. But also number 2, all of us try to separate work-life balance, and sometimes they bleed into each other. Can the staff and the staff's own day and the staff's own sentiment have an impact on the individual? And I think probably anyone watching this would say probably. And so that's actually the next area that we studied, specifically predictive models for staff. And generally, these service notes, they're 2 sides of the same coin. They're written by a staff member, but they're written about an individual that they are providing supports to. And so if an individual, like one of the ones we looked at earlier in the very earlier slides about the individual that was physically aggressive and required a restraint, well, there are only so many ways to write that note. It's generally going to be negative, and it probably should be. However, there is a whole middle area, gray area of notes that, potentially based on how the staff is doing, how they are describing their own mood at the time, they could probably influence the machine learning in the way that they described what they saw and the way that they wrote it. And so we, by and large, when we went through the studies, we showed 3 examples earlier that graphed out 3 individuals, and were able to look through and identify some of their major life events, including a seizure and change of residency and change of primary caregiver, family members had moved away. These were some fairly major life events, surgeries for the individual. And on those, pretty much every person that we looked at told a story through the graph of the positive and negative notes over the course of time. When we started looking at staff, we didn't find the same level. In fact, many staff members were fairly consistent Many staff members work with many different individuals, and if you are working with an individual who's extremely positive and doing very well, your notes sort of reflect that regardless of you, the staff. You have to, there's only so many ways to describe it. And so we found a bit less success, but we found some stories here, but we found a bit less success with identifying the impact on staff, because generally, to the question that was asked, they haven't been biased. They write these notes to describe what they saw, and people have good days and people have bad days. Both the individuals that are supported and the individuals that provide the staff that provide those supports. But we do take a look at a person here that was the story was edited to make sure that we didn't uniquely identify. All these stories have been edited slightly to make sure we don't uniquely identify anybody. The names have been changed. The ages have been changed a little bit. So here is the story of a staff member that Teresa is going to walk us through that can show an example of when the service notes and the sentiment through machine learning can tell us the story of the staff as well.
Marianne is a DSP, or direct support professional. In November of 2021, she is happy that she is pregnant, which is reflected in her notes. In February of 2022, she suffers a miscarriage, and then the notes begin to decline. In July of 2022, a resident sustained an injury during her shift, which she did not report. In August of 2022, employment is terminated.
Teresa. So here's an example of when staff members can have a pretty significant impact on the notes that they're writing for individuals. By and large, given for many individuals that there are various different staff members that come and go over the course of time that work with individuals. It's more to the data that comes about, but we can find the data here. Just kind of going back to the point that we did find the data to be a bit more reliable when looking at the individual's story than the employee's story, which was actually a very good thing for us to find, because that means that the bias level is not that influential on what these service notes look like, although in an example like this one, it's certainly there. So with that, we've had an opportunity today to take a look at epilepsy for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We've had an opportunity to look at depression and anxiety, and also some of the different medications, and then use machine learning to study the experience of the individual through the lens of service notes that are written about that individual. And we're able to identify some pretty clear trends for many of the people that we looked at. Machine learning is in its early phases, and between now and 2029, we will see hopefully a lot more presentations like this one, a lot more applications, because there are decades worth of data that have moved into the cloud and are electronic and are sitting there waiting to be read and reinvigorated to find patterns and to identify new opportunities to apply the data, improve the individual well-being, and improve overall service system performance and outcomes. So to bring it all together, and those lessons learned and what's next, I've mentioned some of those lessons learned. What's next is probably what's here, which is to identify opportunities to go through some of the unstructured data and apply machine learning, but specifically some of the key areas that apply to home and community-based services, that apply to providing services in the health and human services space, where both the federal government is in the process of putting a plan together, as is similar organizations around the world. It's early, but this opens up the door and opportunities for us. Today, we described applications for machine learning that focus on sentiment analysis. In the years ahead, we hope to continue to see more of that sentiment analysis, the positive, the negative, the neutral. But further, through machine learning, the next frontiers are around areas like health diagnosis and events, reading the notes to try to find those items, detecting abuse and neglect, identifying unmet needs, transportation needs, feedback on staff and programming, employment outcomes, community integration and relationship highlights, and housing and food security needs. There are endless possibilities of what could be done with machine learning. And we wanted to move the needle a bit today and continue to move it in the years to come. So with that, I thank everybody for attending, and we can open it up for questions. Thank you, John.
There is one question in the chat. I don't know if you're able to see it, from John Daniels. He said, I'm curious about a Hawthorne effect once staff learn their notes are being used in this way.
Definitely. And Jeff and I have chatted about that. You know, at this point, they don't know because the data, you know, these capabilities weren't really available when those notes were written. So some of this is historically going back. Going forward, you know, as we continue the research and probably functionality in the future that may even tell us staff live in real time the sentiment, right? That, okay, thanks, John. You know, that it is something to be aware of. And honestly, it's so early in the world of machine learning for human services and human service providers that it's a question that we may not know the answer to just yet, but have to be very conscious of in the future rollout and discovery that goes ahead.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Doug, I think it's great that the staff didn't know. From an ethical perspective going forward, if you were intending to do it, that opens up a lot of other questions. But the fact that this came about after the fact gave you a real insight into what the information was. And the staff aren't trained to think about the behavioral impacts of each meds on the individual as much, unless it's part of a nursing plan or a behavioral plan or something like that. So the staff aren't looking for it. You're really pulling this information with you know, they're answering other questions and you're getting these answers. So I like it that it worked that way.
Right.
So I think I'll take this next one, Doug, from Nicole. She said, thank you. As a mom of a teenager with epilepsy, she has experienced certain medications that have caused some behavioral side effects. And I will tell you that's exactly what is going through my mind when I read some of the things that Doug talked about today, because we gave you a short instance of somebody having a seizure and dropping in their scores. But we also know that specifically there are some anti-seizure medications that can aggravate. You mentioned Keppra, that was certainly one where we discovered, especially in the IDD field, it was very interesting because the research came out of our individuals more than any other group that showed that individuals with developmental disabilities react very strongly to the use of that medication with agitation and aggression. And while we may see agitation and aggression in normal intellect people who are on those medications, it is much more severe in our individuals. So we've learned to kind of adjust for that. And in fact, newer medications have now been developed that take a look specifically at the agitation and aggression. The FDA has asked us to look at them, and we now look like we are taking that information based on, it can come from anywhere. You know, this was word of mouth, but what if Doug and Mediscan took a look at that particular drug, looked at the individuals that were on that, and plotted those graphs out for us? Because instead of word of mouth, we would then have solid data that says, perhaps this is a medication that we need to take a closer look at. Maybe we might consider changes to newer medications that don't have psychotropic side effects, all sorts of things. So this is just the very, very early stages. I'm very excited about what might be in the future.
To be able to bring this data to a practitioner is something that hasn't happened either, right? So instead of, again, as you said, the anecdotal information, here you could be tracking like, hey, here's when you switched meds 2 years ago, and this is what we've seen, you know, just another point of data that they can make decisions on.
Yeah, and you know, the point also is you look at the changes in staff that occur over time. So do we have the same director of staff that is working with that individual who may have known that staff for 3 years? Probably not these days. So by Metascan taking a look at this, it gives us the history that, you know, is not just short term, but over several years. It says, hey, you know, we saw this trend happening, and as we see it getting worse and worse and worse, let's make some changes. So great point, Jeff.
One other point on there, and what we were looking for on the staff side is, you know, in 2022, we're going through a period of a staffing crisis that we haven't really seen before. I'm a board member on the Anchor Foundation. Hopefully everybody read our paper on the staffing crisis. And in looking at that, we're hoping that as the technology comes around, if we can hurry it up here, to be able to release something, we may be able to identify trends of staff that are writing more negative notes than they used to, and perhaps provide some interventions to those staff so that they remain staff with the agency, and hopefully through, you know, anything from change of manager to coaching to change of setting for the staff, trying to pick up on that with the staffing pressures that we have today. This gives us yet another tool, hopefully, to identify opportunities. And I should also mention that we worked together with EPI for the data. It's the first time that it's been done. We went through this opportunity here. So this is not commercially available yet. We did this to try to prove out that there actually is the opportunity to do something with it. And it's not just a cool idea, but something that would actually work. And so presentation one, we'll let you all judge how we did, but that's why we did this.
So Janine here is saying that her stepson was on Keppra. He had very bad side effects. He was irritable. And Janine, I will tell you, you know, I'm not here as a pharmacist to say that Keppra is an awful drug, because believe me, it really made a difference for a lot of individuals. But what I am saying is it was the very first drug on the market where we had noted side effects that were psych in nature. And so because of that, now the research with newer drugs are all reporting on the incidence of depression, anxiety. The FDA is really looking closely at suicide attempts, etc. So it is all of that information that really moves the choice of antipsychotic agent, and as well as the research that is being done on anti-seizure medications, and the research that is being done on new anti-seizure medications. So you're absolutely correct. You noticed it firsthand, but it's really interesting concept on whether we could have picked up on that a long time ago.
Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions coming up. So I don't know if you have anything more you'd like to say in closing, but we thank you very much for giving us your time and sharing this wonderful information with us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And thank you to everyone for joining us, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.